Parents demand I buy my sister's house for more than it's worth. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed with a call from my mom. I could tell right away from her tone that this wasn't a typical check-in. She sounded almost too chipper, like she had some exciting news but was trying to hold it back. After some small talk, she finally got to the point. "So," she began, with the kind of exaggerated casualness she uses when she's setting me up for something big, "your sister is thinking of moving out of her house. Starting fresh. She's thinking about selling?" "Oh?" I replied, feigning interest. I had no intention of buying a house, especially not hers. She lived across town, and I was comfortable in my little apartment near my office. Plus, the house was a bit run down, and I'd always felt she hadn't done much to maintain it. But I figured there was no harm in hearing my mom out. "Yes," my mom continued, clearly excited now. "And since your family, she wants to give you the first chance to buy it." I blinked. "Oh, that's thoughtful, but I hadn't really planned on moving." I tried to let her down gently, hoping we could just leave it at that. But Mom wasn't going to let me off that easily. "Well, just think about it. It's a good house and you'd be helping your sister out. Plus, you'll finally have a place to call your own." I sighed, sensing that no wouldn't be an acceptable answer. I asked her how much my sister was asking for. She hesitated for a moment before dropping the number. The price was almost shocking. It wasn't just a little above market value, it was substantially higher. I'd done some research in that neighborhood before, and her asking price could easily buy a larger, better-maintained house nearby. My sister's house wasn't in poor condition exactly, but it was clear she'd been cutting corners with repairs, and it would need some serious updates. I tried to mask my surprise. "Wow, that seems a bit high, doesn't it?" I asked, hoping my mom would acknowledge that maybe this wasn't the best deal. "Oh, honey, it's because we want to help your sister out," she said, with that familiar for the good of the family tone that usually stopped me in my tracks. "She needs the money to pay off some debts and get a fresh start. And wouldn't you rather have the house stay in the family?" Now I was in a tough spot. Family meant everything to me and I was close to my sister. But here they were asking me to pay way more than the house was worth, and it wasn't even clear why they'd set this price. I'd never been one to question family loyalty, but this felt different. Almost manipulative. I could hear my dad chiming in the background, agreeing with my mom and saying things like, "It's just the right thing to do, and we'd do it if we had the money." The guilt started to settle in. They'd always painted me as the responsible one, the rock of the family, and here they were asking me for a favor. Except this favor would cost me a fortune. "Think about it," my mom pressed. "I told your sister you'd come by to see it this weekend. We can talk more then." Without giving me a real chance to say no, she wrapped up the call. I stared at my phone, wondering if this was really happening. Were they seriously expecting me to buy the house out of some vague sense of duty, or was there more to this story? The weekend came faster than I'd hoped, and before I knew it, I was on my way to my parents' house. My mind was racing, trying to sort through what I'd say to them. I'd gone over the numbers multiple times and knew without a doubt that the asking price was way too high. But how do you tell your family, especially parents who've always been there for you, that you won't help? As soon as I arrived, my mom greeted me with her signature warmth, but there was a hint of something else beneath it. Anticipation, maybe. She clearly expected me to say yes without a fuss. We all gathered in the living room, and the house conversation started almost immediately. My mom and dad, both beaming, began to tell me how amazing this opportunity was for me. "Sweetheart, this isn't just any house. It's where your sister started her family," my mom said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a place full of memories. Wouldn't it be wonderful for it to stay in the family?" I nodded politely, but I couldn't help noticing my sister sitting quietly off to the side, looking more uncomfortable than enthusiastic. She hadn't even made eye contact with me since I'd walked in. As the conversation went on, I expressed some hesitation. I tried to be as respectful as possible, saying things like, "I appreciate the offer, but I just don't know if it's the right time, and I'd have to see if I could even afford it." But as soon as they sensed my reluctance, my parents switched gears. "It's your duty to help your sister," my dad chimed in, leaning forward and looking me squarely in the eyes. "Family has always come first in this house, and you've always been the one to step up. You know how much this would mean to her." That family loyalty card hit harder than I wanted to admit. It was true, I'd always been the responsible one. Growing up, my sister was the one who needed more support, who always seemed to stumble into trouble. And each time I'd been there to help her pick up the pieces. But this felt different. They were asking me to make a life-changing financial decision, one that could put me in debt for years, all to help my sister. Sensing my unease, my mom quickly added, We all have to make sacrifices sometimes. Look at what we've done to help you both over the years. This is just part of being a family. We don't abandon each other. Abandon each other? The weight of that statement made my stomach twist. I felt like they were backing me into a corner, painting any choice besides yes as a betrayal. In an attempt to steer the conversation back to logic, I brought up the market value. I did a little research and I noticed that houses in this neighborhood are going for quite a bit less than what you're asking. It's a big financial stretch. But instead of acknowledging my concern, my dad brushed it off. You're not just buying a house, you're supporting your sister. What's a few extra thousand when it's about helping family? It was as if they didn't care that I'd be taking on a financial burden far beyond my means. The conversation started to feel more like an intervention than a discussion. My dad kept talking about honor and duty, while my mom sprinkled in stories from my childhood, reminding me of times they'd gone above and beyond to support us both. You know, my mom said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself, we always thought you'd be the one to help out if the family ever needed it. Your sister just hasn't had the same luck you've had. She looked at me with a mix of expectation and guilt-tripping that was impossible to ignore. It stung because, in their eyes, my success meant I owed them, and my sister, whatever they asked. As the hours dragged on, I felt myself growing smaller under the weight of their expectations. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about my role in the family. They saw me as the reliable one, the one who could always handle things, who wouldn't say no. But this time I wanted to say no. For the first time, I realized that I didn't want to be their safety net. I glanced at my sister, hoping she'd jump in to defuse the situation, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on her lap. I couldn't help but feel resentful. Here I was, being pressured into buying a house I didn't even want, and she didn't seem to care how much I'd have to sacrifice. Maybe she thought I'd just cave in like I always did. By the time I left that evening, I was exhausted, emotionally drained. My parents had managed to plant a seed of doubt in my mind, but I also knew I couldn't keep going along with everything they asked. This was a huge decision, and I was beginning to question if this sense of family obligation was really just a way for them to control me. As I drove home, I wondered if I was being selfish for hesitating. Was it really my responsibility to fix everyone else's problems just because I was the responsible one? Or was it time to start setting boundaries, even if it meant disappointing the people who'd always relied on me? A few days after the family meeting, I decided it was time to get some clarity, so I called my sister to talk things over. She answered after a few rings, sounding casual but distant. It was strange, almost like she knew the reason I was calling and wasn't too thrilled about it. Hey, I started, trying to keep my tone light. So, I've been thinking about the house situation. It's a big deal, you know? Yeah, she replied flatly. I get it. There was an uncomfortable silence on the line. It felt like I was speaking to a stranger, not my sister. Normally, she'd be the first one to get animated, to plead or cajole if she really wanted something. But this time she seemed strangely detached. So, is this really what you want? I asked, hoping she'd give me some genuine insight into her feelings. Are you sure you want to sell the house to me? I mean, if you need the money, I'd understand, but this is a big commitment. She let out a sigh, sounding almost bored. I mean, yeah, it'd be nice to get the money. But I don't really care if you buy it or not. Honestly, it was Mom and Dad's idea more than mine. That response hit me like a punch to the gut. All the pressure, all the guilt, they weren't even coming from her. She hadn't been the one to initiate this. Our parents had. I felt a mix of anger and confusion, as if the ground had suddenly shifted beneath me. What were they playing at? Wait, so, you're not even set on selling it to me? I pressed, needing to understand. Not really, she admitted with a shrug I could almost hear through the phone. Mom and Dad kept saying it would be the perfect solution, that you'd have a place of your own and I could get some cash. I figured if you wanted to buy it, great, but if not, it's whatever. Her indifference was unsettling. If she wasn't pushing for this, why were our parents so determined? Was this really about helping her, or was there something else they weren't telling me? Have you thought about other ways to handle things? I asked, treading carefully. You know, refinancing or renting it out instead? Another sigh. I mean, I thought about it, but Mom and Dad said selling to you would be simpler for everyone. I think they just assumed you'd go along with it since, you know, she trailed off, but I knew what she meant. I'd always been the one to take on the family burdens, to clean up the messes no one else wanted to deal with. It was almost surreal. Here I was, wrestling with a decision that could drastically impact my finances, and my own sister didn't even seem to care. The whole situation was starting to feel like a setup. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just helping family. If anything, it felt like I was being maneuvered into a corner, someone they could count on to foot the bill, so to speak. Listen, I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. I get that you need the money, but why the inflated price? It just doesn't make sense. She was silent for a moment before responding in a hushed tone. I don't know. Dad kept saying the house is worth that much to us, and that you should be willing to pay more because you can afford it. The irritation I'd been holding back started to boil over. Just because I'd saved up and been responsible with my money didn't mean I should be penalized for it. Was this their way of redistributing the family wealth? It was like they were punishing me for my own financial stability, all under the guise of helping my sister. Okay, I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. So if I don't buy it, what's your backup plan? She hesitated. I'm not sure. Mom and Dad made it seem like this was the only real option. They said they didn't want to involve any outsiders, and that it'd be easier to keep things within the family. But honestly, I'm just as confused as you are. I thought they were helping me out, but now, I don't know. Her uncertainty confirmed what I'd been suspecting. This was more about our parents' agenda than hers. They built up this story about family unity, about loyalty, and had placed the responsibility squarely on my shoulders. But I was starting to see through the cracks. Look, I said finally, I just need to understand what's really going on here. If you need the money, I'd consider helping out in other ways, but this whole thing doesn't feel right. It's not fair for everyone to expect me to overpay just because we're family. She was quiet again and then finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I get it. I don't want to put you in a bad spot either. But Mom and Dad, they just keep saying that it's the right thing to do. I ended the call with more questions than answers. What was this right thing they kept referring to? Why were they pushing this deal so hard, even when my sister didn't seem fully on board? I felt like I was being manipulated, guilt-tripped into solving a problem that didn't even seem to have clear reasoning behind it. As I put down the phone, one thing became crystal clear. I needed more answers before I even considered committing to this. If my parents expected me to make such a huge sacrifice, I deserved to know the full story. After my unsettling call with my sister, I realized I needed an outside perspective. Someone who could look at this deal objectively without the weight of family expectations. Thankfully, my friend Sarah, who worked as a realtor, was just the person for the job. She was experienced, practical, and most importantly, she wouldn't sugarcoat anything for me. I met her at a local coffee shop, laptop in tow, ready to lay everything out. Over a few sips of coffee, I explained the situation, sparing no details about the inflated price my parents were pushing, my sister's lukewarm involvement, and the guilt-tripping that had crept into every conversation. Sarah listened carefully, eyebrows furrowing as she flipped through her notes and pulled up listings of comparable houses in my sister's neighborhood. All right, she said, clicking away on her laptop, let's see what we're dealing with here. It didn't take long. Sarah turned the screen towards me, showing a list of similar homes in the area. Many with more recent renovations, larger yards, or even extra bedrooms. The prices for these houses were significantly lower than what my parents were asking. She gave me a sympathetic look and shook her head. Honestly, the price they're asking is way above market value, she said, crossing her arms. Even if the house was fully renovated, which from what you've told me it isn't, it still wouldn't justify the price they're quoting. I let out a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. On one hand, I was glad to have confirmation of what I'd suspected. On the other hand, the reality of my family trying to overcharge me was sinking in even deeper. What do you think I should do? I asked, hoping she'd offer some kind of magic solution that would let me keep my relationship with my family intact without financially sabotaging myself. Sarah thought for a moment. Look, I've seen situations like this before, where families try to keep things in the family, so to speak. But paying a premium just because they're family? That's not fair to you. I'd honestly recommend passing on this. If they want to sell the house that badly, they should be willing to accept a fair market offer. I sighed, knowing deep down that she was right. But in my family, practicality and fairness rarely won out over guilt and obligation. As if reading my thoughts, Sarah gave my arm a reassuring pat. I know it's tough, especially with your parents piling on that family loyalty angle, she said. But that doesn't mean you should let yourself be taken advantage of. Your loyalty to your family shouldn't come at the expense of your own financial security. Her words hit hard. She was right, of course, but I knew my parents wouldn't see it that way. In their minds, family loyalty wasn't just a guiding principle, it was a rule. And in our family, rules weren't broken. Can I ask a blunt question? Sarah continued, sensing my hesitation. Why do they need you to pay such an inflated price? Is there something going on that they're not telling you? I paused, thinking back to the countless hints, guilt trips, and vague mentions of family duty. Honestly, I don't know. They're so focused on pushing me to buy it, but every time I ask why, they just double down on the loyalty angle. It's almost like they think I owe it to them. Sarah looked at me, her face a mixture of sympathy and determination. Well, if they're not willing to be upfront about their reasons, then you have every right to make a decision that's best for you. Family or not, honesty goes both ways. With that, she pulled up more data, going over the average cost per square foot in the neighborhood, recent sales, and potential issues with the property that could arise during an inspection. Each fact she presented felt like another layer of armor, building up my resolve. By the time she finished, I felt more confident but also wary of the fight I knew was coming. As we wrapped up, she gave me one final piece of advice. If they're dead set on you buying it, go in with a counteroffer that's in line with the actual market value. If they're really doing this to help your sister, they should be willing to negotiate. Her words made sense, but I knew my parents weren't the negotiating type. To them, bending on the price would likely feel like admitting they were wrong, which they'd never been keen on doing. Still, Sarah's advice gave me a sliver of hope. Before leaving, Sarah pulled me in for a hug. "Remember, you're not being disloyal by standing up for yourself," she said, giving me a firm look. "Sometimes, setting boundaries is the best way to protect your relationship with them in the long run." As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. But it was quickly replaced by the heavy realization of what I'd need to do next. If my family wanted me to be loyal, then they'd have to show me the same respect. This wasn't just about a house anymore, it was about fairness and honesty. The next conversation with my parents would likely be one of the toughest I'd ever had. But for the first time, I felt prepared to stand my ground. If they wanted my help, they'd have to meet me halfway. The next few weeks were rough. What started as a gentle nudge to help the family had morphed into an unrelenting wave of guilt. Every time I picked up the phone, I braced myself, knowing exactly what was coming. My parents' voices would start off light as if they'd called just to check in, but inevitably the conversation would circle back to the house. My mom would always begin with something sentimental, bringing up memories from my childhood and emphasizing how much my sister and I had meant to each other growing up. But the moment I hesitated or tried to explain my concerns, her tone would shift. "Can't you see we just want what's best for your sister?" she'd say, her voice trembling as if on the verge of tears. "She's worked so hard and this would help her so much. Why can't you see that?" Every call left me feeling drained and conflicted. They painted my hesitation as a betrayal of the family, subtly hinting that by refusing, I was somehow being selfish or ungrateful. It was as though my entire identity within the family was being reduced to this one decision: buy the house or face the consequences. In moments of clarity, I could see how manipulative it was. But it was hard not to feel the pressure. My dad, usually the more reserved one, would jump in with his own appeals. "We raised you to be responsible, to take care of family. This is a chance for you to show that you're willing to make sacrifices. Isn't that what family does?" It was almost surreal. Here they were, asking me to put my financial stability on the line, all while insisting that it was for the good of the family. And every time I tried to bring up the inflated price, they would sidestep, acting as if my concern was trivial compared to my duty to my sister. They didn't care about the comps, or that the market value wasn't anywhere near what they were asking. To them, it was almost like my success meant I should be willing to redistribute my hard-earned money for the family's sake. I felt my sense of self and my achievements fading under the weight of their expectations. One night, during yet another call that quickly devolved into a lecture, my mom's voice cracked with emotion. "Do you want to see your sister struggle? Do you want her to feel abandoned by her own family?" she asked, her tone thick with accusation. I tried to stay calm. "Mom, I want to help, but this isn't the only way to do it. Buying the house at a fair price, or even exploring other options for her financial situation, could be." "No, this is the way we want to handle it," she interrupted, her voice hardening. "We're not bringing in outsiders to meddle with family affairs. You're the only one who can do this for her. It's just a house and you can afford it. Why can't you just do this one thing?" The constant barrage of guilt weighed on me, making it hard to think straight. I started questioning myself, wondering if I really was being selfish. What if they were right? Maybe I was letting my pride get in the way. But then I'd remember Sarah's advice and how clearly she'd explained the unfairness of the deal. Family loyalty shouldn't mean being manipulated into a bad decision. One evening, after a particularly tense conversation, I sat in my apartment, feeling completely trapped. I could either buy the house and sacrifice my financial stability, or refuse and risk losing my family's respect, or maybe even my place in their lives altogether. It was as if they'd set up a lose-lose situation, one in which I'd come out hurt no matter what. Days turned into weeks and the pressure only intensified. My parents called more frequently, each time piling on new reasons why this was for the good of the family. They even tried using my own achievements against me, pointing out how successful and comfortable I was, as if that meant I owed them something. The worst part was that they'd somehow convinced themselves they were right. To them, this wasn't manipulation. It was simply me fulfilling my role in the family. The expectation was clear. I was supposed to fix things, no questions asked. One night, after a particularly long and exhausting day at work, I received another call. My mom's voice was tearful, even more than usual. She launched into an emotional speech about how my sister had confided in her, saying she felt abandoned by me. It felt like an emotional ambush, a last-ditch effort to wear me down. "We don't know what to do with you anymore," she said, her voice thick with disappointment. "You've always been the dependable one. We just don't understand why you're being so difficult now." The accusation stung. Here I was trying to make a fair and well-thought-out decision, and all they could see was me letting them down. Every conversation left me feeling like I was the one being unreasonable, even though deep down, I knew the request itself was outrageous. With each call I felt the walls closing in. How much longer could I keep this up? After weeks of dodging calls, endless arguments and growing frustration, I agreed to a family meeting. It seemed like the only way to get everything out in the open, to say my piece once and for all. Maybe, I hoped, they'd finally understand where I was coming from if they heard it directly from me. I wanted to believe that, face-to-face, they'd listen. We met at my parents' house on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Walking into the living room, I noticed the familiar family photos and heirlooms that had lined these walls my entire life. They felt oddly foreign now, like relics from a past where family had meant warmth and support, not obligation and sacrifice. My parents were waiting on the couch, looking almost solemn, as if preparing for a formal negotiation. My sister sat next to them, but she seemed withdrawn, looking down at her hands. I tried to catch her eye, but she wouldn't meet my gaze. Something about her silence unnerved me, but I brushed it off, focusing instead on what I needed to say. After a few moments of awkward small talk, my dad cleared his throat and launched into his speech. "We asked you here because we want to talk about this house situation as a family," he began, his tone calm but firm. "It's not just about money. This is about family values and helping each other out when we need it most." My mom took over, her voice filled with a practiced sincerity that I'd grown to dread. "We raised you both to be there for each other," she said, looking pointedly at me. "Your sister has put so much into that house and it's been such a big part of her life. All we're asking is that you take it on, to help her move forward." They continued with their carefully crafted arguments, recounting stories of family vacations, old sacrifices, and reminders of how they'd supported me through my own tough times. With every word, they were framing this as a moral obligation, almost as if I owed it to them, and to my sister, to make this happen. But the entire time my sister sat silently, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't say a word even when my parents pointedly brought up how much this meant to her. The silence was deafening and it was starting to make me feel uneasy. If this house meant so much to her, why wasn't she speaking up? Why wasn't she backing them up? Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer. I turned to her, trying to keep my tone calm. "I'm just curious, Sarah. What do you want out of this? I mean, this is your house. Why aren't you part of this conversation?" She looked up, startled, as if I'd caught her off guard. She hesitated, glancing at my parents, who were both staring at her expectantly, waiting for her to back up their claims. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I just thought this was what everyone wanted." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and ambiguous. Something didn't feel right. Why was she saying everyone wanted instead of what she wanted? I pressed on, my frustration bubbling over. "But is this what you want?" I asked, trying to keep my tone gentle but firm. "Do you actually want me to buy the house at this price? Or is there something else going on?" There was another long silence. My sister fidgeted uncomfortably and I noticed a flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe relief, cross her face. Finally she sighed and looked away, muttering, "I don't know." My parents jumped in, quick to cover up her uncertainty. "Your sister has been under a lot of stress," my mom said, giving me a reproachful look. "This would make things so much easier for her, and you know that. Why are you pushing her like this?" But I wasn't buying it anymore. There was clearly more to the story and I wasn't going to back down without answers. I leaned forward, looking directly at my sister. "Sarah, if this isn't something you actually want, you need to tell me. I can't go through with this if it's just about some sense of family obligation. It's too big a decision to make for the wrong reasons. She glanced at our parents, clearly uncomfortable, before speaking again, her voice hesitant. Honestly, I just didn't think I had a choice. Mom and Dad kept telling me that you'd be able to handle it and that it was the best way to help me get a fresh start. I didn't want to push you, but they insisted it would be best for everyone. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. All this time, my parents had framed this as my sister's need, as something that would help her move on. But here she was, revealing that it wasn't really her desire at all, it was theirs. I turned back to my parents, my voice steady but laced with anger. So, this whole thing was your idea? You've been pushing this on both of us, even though Sarah wasn't fully on board? My dad's face darkened. We're just looking out for the family, he said defensively. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for each other. You wouldn't understand that? But I'd had enough. Sacrifices are one thing, I replied, my voice firm, but this feels like manipulation. You wanted me to take on the financial burden, but you didn't even bother to ask if Sarah truly wanted it. You both set this up without considering what either of us wanted. The room fell into an awkward silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air. My parents shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for me to challenge them so directly. My sister looked relieved, though still tense, as if she'd been carrying a burden she hadn't even realized was weighing her down. Finally I stood up, feeling a newfound resolve. If this house is going to be sold, it's going to be at a fair price. And if you want to help Sarah, we can all discuss ways to do that. But I'm not agreeing to this deal just because you think it's my duty. With that, I walked out, leaving my family sitting in stunned silence. As I stepped outside, a wave of relief washed over me. I didn't know what the fallout would be, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd finally taken control of the situation. A few days after the tense family meeting, my sister and I decided to meet up for coffee. She seemed more relaxed, even relieved, without our parents hovering over her. We talked about casual things at first, catching up on life outside of the house issue. But as the evening wore on, it felt like there was something she wanted to say but couldn't quite find the courage to get out. Finally, during a lull in the conversation, she sighed and looked away. There's something I haven't told you about the house situation, she admitted, almost as if confessing a secret. I felt a wave of apprehension. What do you mean? She fidgeted, tracing patterns on the table with her finger, avoiding my gaze. The thing is, I'm not really looking to sell the house, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I actually wanted to keep it as a rental property. I was hoping it could bring in some extra income, especially since I'm dealing with a lot of debt right now. Her words left me stunned. Here I'd been, under the impression that she was desperate to sell, that I was somehow her only option. But now she was telling me she hadn't even planned on selling it at all. The entire premise of this deal started to crumble in my mind. I leaned forward, trying to make sense of what she was saying. So, you didn't want to sell, but our parents pushed you to ask me? She nodded, looking both embarrassed and relieved to finally be telling the truth. Yeah. They think this is the best way to help me clear my debt without it affecting them financially. They know you're more stable, and I guess they thought you'd just agree to buy it without any fuss. I didn't really have much say in it. They'd been so insistent that I felt like I had no choice. I sat back, letting her words sink in. Suddenly, everything made sense. The inflated price, my parents' intense pressure, my sister's silence during the family meeting. They had framed this entire thing as a selfless act for my sister, but in reality, they were protecting their own finances. Instead of offering to help her themselves, they had tried to put the burden on me, thinking I'd accept it for the sake of family loyalty. My sister continued, her voice apologetic. I'm really sorry for not telling you sooner. I didn't know how to say it, and I didn't want to disappoint Mom and Dad. They made it sound like this was the only solution, and I was afraid of what they'd say if I pushed back. I felt a mixture of anger and disappointment, not toward her but toward my parents. They had manipulated both of us, convincing her to go along with a plan that she didn't even want and putting me in a position where I felt guilty for not immediately agreeing. I shook my head, still processing everything. You know, I said, trying to keep my tone calm, if you're in debt and want to keep the house as a rental, that's something we could have talked about. There are other ways to support you without you having to give up the house or forcing me to overpay. I'm willing to help, but not like this. She looked at me, relief flooding her face. I'd be so grateful if you could help me figure something out. I didn't even want to involve you, but I didn't know how to tell Mom and Dad no. They'd been putting so much pressure on me. We sat in silence for a few moments, both lost in thought. My mind was racing with all the implications. Our parents had gone to great lengths to craft a narrative that would tug at my sense of duty, all while keeping us both in the dark about each other's true wishes. It was hard not to feel betrayed. But as I looked at my sister, I realized she was just as much a victim of their expectations as I was. I could see the weight of their pressure in her posture, in the way she looked almost ashamed for being honest with me. I reached across the table and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll figure this out," I promised. "If you want to keep the house, there are options. Maybe refinancing or even finding a partner to help with the rental process. We don't need to follow Mom and Dad's plan if it's not right for us." She nodded, looking visibly relieved, and I could see a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm so sorry they put you in this position." As we sat there, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. My parents might have crafted this entire scheme to suit their own narrative, but they didn't control my decisions. For the first time since this mess began, I felt like I had a real say in how things would unfold. With a plan starting to take shape, I decided it was time to confront my parents and lay everything out in the open. Armed with the truth, I felt a new sense of resolve as I headed over to my parents' house for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say, hoping that I could stay calm, lay out the facts, and finally set things straight. In some small part of me, I hoped they'd recognize the unfairness of their scheme once I explained it, that they'd see the toll this whole ordeal was taking on both my sister and me. The moment I walked in, I could sense their tension. My mom glanced up with that overly polite expression she used when she knew something uncomfortable was about to happen. My dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "So, you've decided to do the right thing?" he asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. I took a deep breath. "Actually, I came here to talk to you about the house situation," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "I know about Sarah's debts, and I know that she wasn't even planning on selling the house. She told me everything." The silence was instant, thick with tension. My mom's face twisted in surprise, then irritation. My dad finally put down his paper, crossing his arms and narrowing his eyes. "And?" he asked coldly, as if daring me to challenge him. "And I'm not going to buy the house at the price you're asking," I said, standing firm. "It's unfair and it's not what Sarah really wants. I'd be willing to help her in other ways, but not like this." They both stared at me, expressions shifting from shock to anger. My mom was the first to speak, her voice quivering with indignation. "How could you say that after everything we've done for you? Your father and I have sacrificed so much for this family, and this is how you repay us? By refusing to help your sister?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This isn't about helping Sarah," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "If it were, you'd have been honest from the start. This is about you pushing a financial burden onto me to protect your own money." My dad scoffed, looking at me as if I were the most ungrateful person in the world. "So that's how you see it? You think we're just using you?" "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze. "You're asking me to overpay for a house that Sarah doesn't even want to sell. All because you think I owe it to the family. But what about my own life? My own financial future? I can't sacrifice everything just because you think it's the right thing to do." My mom's face hardened. "Your sister is struggling and all we're asking is that you step up. Is that too much to ask?" I clenched my fists, feeling the anger rising in me. "You're asking me to take on debt and overpay for something I don't need, all for a scheme that isn't even in Sarah's best interest. This isn't about loyalty, it's about manipulation." For a moment they said nothing. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see reason, that they'd realize they'd been unfair. But instead my dad shook his head, his expression cold and unyielding. "We raised you better than this," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "Family comes first. Clearly you've lost sight of that. And where does that end?" I shot back, my voice rising. "How much am I supposed to give up before it's enough for you? I love this family, but I won't be taken advantage of. Not by the people who are supposed to care about me." My mom's eyes flashed and she folded her arms, her voice icy. "You're being selfish, and honestly I'm ashamed. After everything we've done for you, you can't make this one sacrifice? For your own sister?" Her words stung, but I wasn't going to back down. I had finally seen the truth behind their expectations. "I'm not the one being selfish here," I said quietly. "I'm the one setting a boundary because you both won't. I won't apologize for that." The silence that followed was tense and uncomfortable. My parents looked at each other, clearly unwilling to back down. But I wasn't going to budge either. I'd finally stood up for myself and made my position clear, and as much as it hurt to see the disappointment in their faces, I knew it was the right thing to do. Finally my dad spoke, his tone low and final. "Fine. If that's how you want it, Don't expect us to come running if you ever need anything. I swallowed, feeling the sting of his words but refusing to let them show on my face. Noted, I replied. And with that, I turned and left, feeling a mix of sadness, anger, and a strange sense of liberation. As I walked out of their house, I knew that things would never be the same. But I also knew that I'd finally chosen my own path, one that I wouldn't regret. The fallout from that conversation was worse than I'd ever imagined. For the first few days after I stood my ground, there was complete radio silence. My parents barely spoke to me. If I called, they'd answer with curt, monosyllabic responses. If I texted, the replies were cold and distant, with no warmth or acknowledgement of the past, no sign of the close-knit family dynamic we once had. They treated me like a stranger, like I'd betrayed them in the worst possible way. At first, I tried to reach out, sending messages to let them know I still loved them despite the tension. But those messages were met with silence. I could feel the distance growing wider with every passing day. The silence felt like a heavy weight pressing down on me, and I found myself second-guessing everything. Was I really in the wrong? Should I have just given in? Maybe I was being stubborn, selfish even. But no matter how much my mind tried to convince me otherwise, deep down I knew I couldn't sacrifice my financial future for their plan. My sister was the hardest part. We'd always been close, but after our conversation, I didn't hear from her at all. No phone calls. No texts. No emails. It felt like she'd disappeared from my life entirely. I tried to reach out, but the messages went unanswered. I wondered if she was caught in the middle, trying to please our parents and not knowing how to handle the situation. Or worse, maybe she was upset with me for not helping her in the way they expected. I wasn't sure anymore. Days turned into weeks, and the silence persisted. The longer this went on, the more isolated I felt. I had always been the one to fix things, the one who stepped in when there was trouble, the one who was always there. Now it felt like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fix what was broken. My parents and sister were disappointed in me, and in a way, I felt like I had let them down. But then, one evening as I sat alone in my apartment, I finally let myself truly reflect on the decision I had made. The weight of it all settled in, and for the first time in a while, I allowed myself to feel proud of what I'd done. I had chosen my own financial stability over a plan that would have hurt me in the long run. I hadn't sacrificed my future for their comfort, and though it was painful, I knew I had done the right thing. It didn't take long before the reality of the situation hit me. I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was also standing up for what was fair. My sister hadn't wanted to sell the house in the first place. The financial burden wasn't mine to carry. I wasn't the one who had gotten her into debt, and I certainly wasn't the one who should be responsible for bailing her out. It had never been about family loyalty. It had always been about protecting their own finances while pushing the burden onto me. But even with that clarity, the hardest part was still coming. I had to make a difficult decision. Should I continue trying to repair the fractured relationships with my family, or should I accept that things might never go back to the way they were? The thought of losing my parents and sister for good weighed heavily on me, but I knew that no matter how much I loved them, I couldn't keep enabling behavior that wasn't healthy for me. A few days later, I received a text from my sister, a short and vague message. "We need to talk. Call me when you can." My heart sank. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or nervous. Was she finally ready to confront everything, or was she still mad at me? I debated for hours whether I should call her back immediately or wait until I had a clearer head. Eventually I called her. She picked up quickly, but her voice was quiet and uncertain. "Hey, I've been thinking a lot about everything, about what happened between us and with Mom and Dad." I took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about it too. I know this whole thing has been tough for everyone, and I never wanted to hurt you. But I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't buy the house, not when it didn't make sense financially." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I know. I understand why you did what you did. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to disappoint Mom and Dad, and I didn't want to lose you too." Her words hit me harder than I expected. It was clear that she had been stuck in the middle this whole time, torn between our parents' pressure and her own struggles. I felt a pang of guilt for not realizing that sooner. "I'm sorry for not telling you everything earlier," she continued. "I was afraid if I spoke up it would make things worse. But I didn't want you to feel like you had to carry this burden alone. I wish I had been more honest with you." I let out a shaky breath. "I wish you had too. But I understand why you didn't. You were caught in the middle. I get it now." We talked for a while longer, and though things were far from fixed, it felt like a step in the right direction. My sister wasn't angry at me anymore, and I wasn't angry at her. We both had been manipulated by our parents in different ways, and while the damage was done, There was still a glimmer of hope that we could rebuild our relationship. But the bigger question still lingered: would my parents ever understand? Could they ever see how unfair they had been? Or would they continue to see me as the one who betrayed the family? Only time would tell. In the end, I didn't buy the house. I stuck to my decision, even though it's been one of the hardest things I've ever done. I thought about the long-term consequences, what it would mean for my financial future, my emotional well-being, and my ability to create a life that felt authentic to me. And while the decision to walk away was painful, I knew it was the right one. Since then, I haven't heard from my family. It's been weeks, and the silence has been deafening. My parents haven't reached out. My sister hasn't texted or called. It's like I've been erased from their lives. At first, it hurt more than I thought it would. I found myself replaying everything. Was I too harsh? Did I overreact? Should I have just given in and bought the house for the sake of keeping the peace? But with time, the hurt has started to fade. I still love my family deeply, but I've come to realize that love isn't about sacrificing your own well-being to appease others. It's about respect, mutual understanding, and healthy boundaries. I can't keep living my life in a way that only serves the interests of others, no matter how much I care about them. I've started focusing more on my own life, on my goals, my financial independence, and my personal growth. Without the constant pressure from my parents, I've been able to make decisions that align with my own values. I've spent more time with friends who support and understand me, people who encourage me to follow my own path, no matter how difficult it may be. As much as it still stings to be at odds with my family, I know this is a necessary step in my journey. I've learned that it's okay to say no. It's okay to set boundaries, even with the people you love. Sometimes saying no is the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for them. I've also come to realize that my family's reaction is theirs to deal with, not mine. They have their own process of coming to terms with what happened, just like I have mine. I can't control how they respond, nor can I force them to understand my perspective. What I can do is continue living my life with integrity, standing firm in my decisions, and trusting that in time, things will either improve or I'll learn to accept that they may never be the same again. In the meantime, I'm learning how to be okay with that. I'm learning how to move forward without waiting for validation or approval from others. I've taken steps to make sure I never let anyone manipulate me into sacrificing my future again. It's not easy. There are days when I miss the way things used to be, when I long for the closeness we once shared. But I've also come to understand that sometimes, distance is what's needed to create healthier relationships in the long run. As I continue on this journey of personal growth, I'm learning to trust myself more. I'm learning to be unapologetically me. And while I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my family, I do know that I'm building a life that reflects who I truly am, not who others want me to be. For now, I'm standing my ground and I'm okay with that. AITA for being furious with my pregnant wife over a prank? I, 31M, have been with my wife Lisa since college, and I'll admit, one of the things that first drew me to her was her incredible sense of humor. Lisa is witty, quick on her feet, and loves to play pranks. She's the type of person who will tell you a wild story with such conviction that even the most skeptical person might believe it. She's always been a little bit of a prankster, but as time went on, her pranks got more elaborate, and I became the frequent target. At first, I was an easy mark. I'm not the sharpest when it comes to catching on to jokes, so I'd often fall for her stories, big, outlandish tales about things that could be true but really weren't. One time, she convinced me that she had a long-lost sibling from a previous marriage. I spent an entire evening processing this new information, only for her to reveal she'd just made it up. I was embarrassed, of course, but she was laughing so hard I couldn't help but laugh along with her. Over the years, I started catching on more quickly. I became less gullible, and Lisa had to work harder to pull off her pranks. I could tell when she was setting me up, but there were still moments when her acting was so good, I couldn't help but doubt myself. She'd throw in details that made everything sound convincing, like a story about her childhood or a news story she'd just heard, and I'd get caught up in it. It was always funny when I realized it was a joke, but after a few years I began to notice that her pranks had a pattern. They were getting more personal and sometimes felt a little too real. Even though I started getting better at recognizing her setups, Lisa still loved pushing the boundaries. Sometimes it was harmless, silly stuff like pretending to be someone else on the phone, or telling me she'd forgotten to do something important. Other times, though, her pranks would involve real-life situations, and that's when things started to feel a little off. She'd prank me about trivial things, sure, but also about deeper, more sensitive topics, like when she pretended she had a surprise job offer out of nowhere, or one time when she joked about moving to another city without telling me first. It was clear she was getting more creative with her pranks, and I'd gotten used to laughing things off, but sometimes I wondered if it was all still in good fun, or if there was something more to her pranking nature. Either way, I was still invested in her playful side. She had this energy that could light up a room, and even when she pulled off her biggest pranks, I couldn't stay mad for too long. I knew she didn't mean any harm. But deep down, I was starting to question whether all of this joking around might one day cross a line. That thought was in the back of my mind when the most recent prank started to unfold. I never could have predicted just how far she was about to take it. Today, when I walked through the front door after a long day at work, I was hit with an atmosphere I didn't expect. Lisa was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and her eyes were red as though she'd been crying for a while. I immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. She looked up at me when I entered, and without saying anything, she motioned for me to sit down. Her face was pale, and her voice trembled when she spoke. "We need to talk. I'm really scared you'll leave me." I could see her trying to hold back tears, but they kept slipping out. My heart sank. I had never seen her so distressed before, and it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My mind immediately raced. I asked her over and over what was wrong, pressing her because I had no idea where this was coming from. She kept stalling, saying it was hard to say, that she didn't know how I'd take it, that it was something she'd been carrying for a while. The fear on her face was palpable. It was clear she wasn't making light of this. After a few moments of silence, she finally spoke, but her words hit me like a ton of bricks. "A few months ago, I had an affair with my boss, and I'm not sure if the baby we're expecting is yours." The world seemed to stop. My heart thudded in my chest and the blood rushed to my ears. I couldn't process what she was saying. It was like my brain was refusing to accept her words. The shock was so intense. I felt the room spinning and my thoughts were chaotic. Could this be real? Was she serious? Or was this some kind of sick joke like one of her pranks? I sat there frozen, trying to find words, trying to get my head around it. What do you mean?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely audible. I could feel my body stiffen with anxiety, confusion, and dread. Every part of me screamed that this couldn't be real, that Lisa wouldn't do something like that to me, especially not now when we were preparing for our first child. But she didn't stop. She looked at me, her face now a mess of tears, and kept going. "I know it sounds bad, but it's true. I don't even know how it happened. It was a huge mistake and now I don't know what to do." I started pacing, my thoughts moving too fast to keep up. My mind was flooded with questions. How long had this been going on? How could she do this to me? I felt a flood of emotions, hurt, anger, confusion, and I was struggling to make sense of it. Was she telling the truth? Was this some kind of test or a twisted way to see how much I loved her? Could this be a prank? I kept thinking, no way, this can't be real. But the look on her face, the way she was sobbing, told me she wasn't just playing around. The silence between us grew thicker as I tried to process it. I kept replaying her words in my mind. "I don't know if the baby is yours." The phrase echoed, the weight of it crushing me. This wasn't just a simple joke, not like all the others. This was a serious accusation, and it made my stomach churn in a way no prank ever had before. It felt like everything I knew about my life, my relationship, and our future was suddenly up in the air, and I had no way of bringing it back down. I stopped pacing and looked at her, my mind racing. "You can't be serious. Are you really telling me this?" The question hung in the air, but Lisa wasn't laughing. She wasn't pulling any usual pranking theatrics. She just sat there, staring at me with tears in her eyes, waiting for a response, and I couldn't help but wonder, what the hell was going on? The silence that had filled the room was suffocating. My mind was still spinning, trying to process the shock of what Lisa had just told me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I struggled to find any sense in what she had said. I stared at her, my mind still not fully grasping the weight of her words, but then something unexpected happened. Without warning, Lisa suddenly broke into laughter. It started as a quiet chuckle, and then quickly escalated into full-blown laughter. The tears she had been shedding moments before disappeared in an instant, replaced by fits of giggles that felt completely out of place in this situation. My mind took a moment to catch up with what was happening. Was I missing something? Was this part of the joke? But as I looked at her, I saw her face contort with amusement, her laughter becoming louder and more animated. It hit me all at once, she had been playing me the whole time. She wiped away the last of her tears, still laughing uncontrollably, and finally managed to speak between her fits of giggles. "Oh my God, I can't believe you actually fell for that. There's no affair. The baby is definitely yours." I froze. The relief I should have felt was completely overshadowed by the seething anger that immediately bubbled up inside me. This was all a joke? She had made me believe, for what felt like an eternity, that everything I'd been looking forward to, the future we'd been planning together, was suddenly uncertain. And all of it, all of that stress and fear, was nothing but a cruel prank. I took a step back, my hands clenched into fists, trying to contain the rush of emotions that were flooding my system. I couldn't understand how she could think this was funny. To joke about infidelity and paternity wasn't just insensitive, it was cruel. I thought about how worried I had been, pacing the room, feeling completely blindsided by what she had said. And now, after all that, she was laughing it off like it was no big deal? Are you serious? I managed to get out, my voice shaking with disbelief and frustration. How could you think that's funny, Lisa? How could you joke about something like that? This isn't just some small prank. You made me believe that you cheated on me, that our baby might not even be mine. Do you understand how that feels? Her laughter slowed as she looked at me, but she still seemed unable to grasp the gravity of what she had just done. Come on, it was just a joke. You're overreacting. I was just messing with you. I never thought you'd actually believe it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could she be so casual about this? I felt betrayed, but more than that, I felt disrespected. This wasn't just another one of her harmless pranks. She had crossed a line and there was no turning back from it. I thought back to all the times she'd pulled similar stunts, telling me ridiculous stories or pretending things were real just to see my reaction. But this felt different. This was something personal. This was about trust, and in one fell swoop she had shattered it. How can you say I'm overreacting? I snapped, struggling to keep my voice steady. You made me think you cheated on me. You made me think that our baby might not even be mine. That's not funny. You don't joke about things like that. Her expression changed a little, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of realization in her eyes. Maybe she could see the hurt she'd caused. But instead of apologizing, she just shrugged and said, "It wasn't supposed to go this far, I just wanted to see how you'd react. I didn't mean to upset you. I couldn't hold it in anymore." Well, you did upset me. You've gone too far this time. I stood there, seething with anger, and for the first time in a long time, I realized that this prank wasn't just about the joke. It was about how much I could take. How far could she push me before I stopped finding her antics funny? This had gone way beyond the playful jokes I'd put up with for years. It had cut deep, and I wasn't sure how I could look at her the same way after this. I was still in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. My heart was racing and I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I didn't know how to express it. Lisa, on the other hand, seemed genuinely confused by my reaction. She sat there, her teary eyes now wide with disbelief, as if she couldn't understand why I was so upset. "Why did you believe it though?" she asked, almost sounding hurt. "You know I joke around. Why did this one get to you so much?" I was at a loss for words. Of course, I knew she had a history of pulling pranks and I'd fallen for her stories plenty of times before. But this was on a completely different level. I tried to explain as calmly as I could, but the frustration kept building up inside me. "Lisa, do you honestly think that was just another joke? You made me believe you cheated on me and that the baby might not even be mine. How could you not see how that's not funny? How could you not get why I'm upset?" Her expression wavered between confusion and a hint of defensiveness. "But you've always been gullible. I didn't think it'd be such a big deal." Her voice cracked as she added, "Why don't you trust me?" That question hit me harder than any prank ever could. Why don't I trust you? Was she seriously asking me that right now? I wanted to scream. Of course I trusted her. Or at least, I had before she decided it would be funny to make me believe she'd cheated on me. I felt like I had been knocked off balance. It was as if my entire perception of her had been shattered in a matter of minutes. How could I trust her again after that? How could I ever look at her the same way when she was capable of pulling something so hurtful, even if it was just a joke? "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know how I'm supposed to trust you after this. I can't. Not right now." Her face crumpled as she wiped her eyes, and I could see the guilt starting to settle in, but it didn't help. The damage was already done. She didn't understand why I was so upset, and I couldn't make her see it. I needed space, desperately. I couldn't stand there and keep having the same conversation over and over. It wasn't about the prank anymore, it was about the fact that she hadn't stopped when she saw how much it was affecting me. I stood up and said, "I can't do this right now. I just need to be alone for a while." Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my jacket and walked out. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get out of that house, away from her, and clear my head. My hands were shaking and my mind was racing. I ended up at a speakeasy I liked to visit whenever I needed to think things through. I ordered a drink, But the alcohol didn't seem to help dull the feeling of betrayal and frustration that had taken over me. I stayed there for hours, just sitting in silence, trying to process everything that had just happened. Every time I tried to think about it, I just kept coming back to the same question. How could she think that was okay? I hadn't planned on staying away long, but once I realized how deep the wound was, I knew I needed more time. I couldn't go back yet. Not when I felt like I was still shaking off the anger and confusion. I didn't want to talk to her right now. I didn't want to hear any more excuses. I just needed to breathe and think about what this meant for our relationship. I didn't respond to her calls or texts, and as the night wore on, I began to wonder if I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a joke. Maybe I should have been able to laugh it off like I had with all her other pranks. But this one felt different. It had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure if I could move past it without feeling like I'd been made a fool of. I knew I'd have to talk to her eventually, but not tonight. Not when my head was still spinning. Here I am, sitting alone in this speakeasy, nursing my drink and feeling more confused than ever. Lisa's prank was a total shock to me, and now, as the hours drag on and the alcohol doesn't seem to ease my thoughts, I keep replaying the situation in my head. I've always known Lisa had a playful side and we've had our fair share of jokes, but this one felt different. Was I overreacting? Was I being too sensitive about something that was, in the end, just a joke? Maybe I should have laughed it off. I mean, I've laughed at her other pranks before. They've always been harmless, right? The fake facts, the ridiculous stories, those were funny and lighthearted. But this? This wasn't just a prank. She made me believe that she cheated on me and that our baby might not even be mine. It wasn't some harmless laugh. It was emotional manipulation, and it really hurt. On the other hand, I know she's pregnant and hormones can mess with emotions. Maybe that's why she thought it was funny. Maybe, in her mind, it was just a prank and she didn't realize how much it would affect me. I've always known she loves her pranks, and I've always been the one to fall for them because I'm gullible. But this one hit way harder than anything before. I can't help but feel betrayed. It wasn't just a prank, it was something that touched on trust, loyalty, and the foundation of our relationship. Those are some heavy topics to joke about, especially when emotions are already running high with the pregnancy. I keep going back to how it made me feel. I was genuinely scared when she told me about the affair, terrified of the idea that the baby might not be mine. That's not something you joke about. And to go even further by continuing the act, even when I was visibly upset, that felt like it crossed a line. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to feel in this situation. Am I supposed to just shrug it off and act like it's no big deal? And then there's the question of why I didn't stop her earlier. I could have caught on right away, but I didn't. I trusted her, and she took advantage of that trust to pull off what she thought was a funny prank. But the damage it did to me emotionally wasn't something I could just laugh off. Maybe I should have known it was a joke, but when you're in that moment, it's hard to keep your cool, especially when you're being hit with such an emotional bombshell. It's hard not to feel angry. I don't want to put extra stress on her because of the pregnancy, but at the same time I can't help how I feel. This wasn't just a prank. It was a betrayal of trust, and it left me questioning her motives. Did she really not know how deeply this would affect me, or did she think I'd just laugh it off like the other times? And why didn't she stop once she saw how upset I was? I'm still not ready to talk to her. I need more time. I'm not sure if I'm overreacting, but I know I can't go back and pretend it didn't happen. I need to figure out how I feel about all of this, and I'm not sure if I can just let it go. So Reddit, AITA for being furious about this prank, or am I overreacting? Should I have laughed it off like all the other jokes? Or did she really cross a line this time?